Apologies for the delay. I was having some technical issues on my end. But I thank everybody for joining us. Eventually it'll be us, but right now it's just me. Joining me for another fine episode of the Artisans of Steel podcast. This is conversations with some of the most talented knife makers, blade makers, damascus makers in the world right now of our modern times. And I feel very fortunate to have my friend, Jamie Lundell. um, he's a super talented maker, has quite a wide variety and an array of skills that we'll dive into and talk about. But before we do that, we want to get into the sponsors. So we're going to kick it off with our friend Russell Tinsley. He's the owner of Ouzel Finch Beers. He's Ouzel Finch Beers on Instagram. Go check him out. He's also has the Nost Brewing Project. He's based out of Virginia, and the Nost Brewing Project is kind of a take on brewing nostalgic beers but with better ingredients. So they're like, oh, this you drink one of the beers, and I've tasted them. They're awesome. And it's you taste one and it tastes familiar. It tastes like something that maybe was one of the first couple of beers you ever drank, but it's way better. It's like ten levels higher. It's just made with higher quality ingredients, smaller batches, so they have better control over everything in the whole process. And it's a much higher quality beer. So go check out Russell Tinsley's pages, Ouzel Finch Beers, and Nost. That's Nost Brewing Project, Nost Brewing. The next one is Maritime Knife Supply. They are a Canadian knife supplier based out of Atlantic, Canada. You can go find their stuff, maritimeknifesupply.com. They have everything from grinders to anvils to handle materials to basically anything, to tongs, like anything you can think of that you might need for doing your knife making work. um, Maritime Knife Supply has got you covered there. Our next super sponsor is Mr. Gabe Fletcher. He is the owner and operator of Anchorage Brewing, where I recently just came back from, and we brewed or blended an awesome triple oaked imperial stout that is at 16%. So please drink responsibly. But it's basically five beers in one, and but it packs so much flavor. It was, like I said, it was triple oaked through a couple different rounds of Buffalo Trace and one of Woodford Reserve. And what else? Oh, we finished it on toasted coconut, and then some of the big truck coffee blend from a local coffee roastery here in my town called Olympia Coffee Roasters, and it is an awesome beer. Um, and so go check out Anchorage Brewing. You can find them, Anchorage Brewing, on Instagram, as well as Anchorage Forge. That is the name of Gabe's shop. He's just starting his knife making adventure, and you can follow him along there. Our next super sponsor is Anthony Sasma. He's TNT Forge. He's on Instagram at TNT Forge. You can follow him and the work that he's doing with his chef's knives and making his Damascus, and he's getting phenomenal finishes on those blades. Go check him out. He's doing some good work. He's a great guy. We got Brian Hinnenkamp of Tortuga Blade Works. You can find him at Tortuga Blade Works, also on Instagram and Facebook. He's doing a lot of really cool sandmai blades, and he does some brute to forge work as well. A lot of the work so far, it looks like, are mostly like hard use hunters and bowies and stuff like that, camp knives. But he's doing a really great job. They're good looking knives, so go check them out. Again, that's Tortuga Blade Works. And then we have Josh Weston, my buddy Josh A. Weston on Instagram. He's also part of the Dragon Forge experience. And he's just a super creative, talented guy. He goes around the Dragon Forge experience to various what are they? Renaissance fairs, where they set up a cordoned off area with these, I think it's two, if not three, dragons, and the forges, they build out dragons around the forges, so it looks like dragons breathing fire, like you're forging out of the mouth of a dragon. It's super fun experience, super cool, very unique. I would love to get a hold of one of those dragon forges. They're super rad. So go check him out. Again, Josh A. Weston on Instagram. And then finally, last but not least, birthday boy Mr. Michael Poor. Red Dragon Forge on Instagram. Today's his birthday. He's doing some cool stuff. He actually just signed up for mine and Jamie's friend Peter Swarsbert's Patreon, where he is playing with some non-ferrous metal clays to do some interesting mokume work. So go check out Michael Poor or Mike Poor. I keep calling him Michael. It seems so formal, but it's Mike Poor, Red Dragon Forge on Instagram. And without further ado, my friend, everybody's friend, Jamie Lundell, Knight's Fire Forge, also part of Dragon's Breath Forge, also Forge and Fire champion, engraver, carver of bone and wood alike, amazing and very talented Damascus forger, and sword forger and Damascus maker, doing some really, really unique and very complex and challenging work with swords and mosaic Damascus, and we'll get into some of that later. But thanks for joining, Jamie. How you doing?
Absolutely, it's good to be here.
How have things been lately?
Things have been hectic and interesting.
Okay, hopefully that's a good thing.
Oh yeah, man. Well, it's always hectic, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
There's always too many things to get done.
Yeah.
But
You've been taking on a lot of sword commission. You and I talk a lot outside of the show because we are actual friends, and you got it in IRL, and we have you've told me several times you got a lot of work in front of you, and that I sometimes I feel bad when we talk on the phone because I'm like, oh my god, I'm keeping him from doing his work, but hopefully you don't feel too stressed out about it. But before we get too deep into where you're at right now and what you got going on, I want to know where you got started. I know so you're part of Dragon's Breath Forge, but before Dragon's Breath Forge you were on your own as Nightfire Forge, and even before that, like you grew up in Connecticut where I moved to, and we eventually worked together with like I feel like you were like probably a really high energy kid that had a lot going on, and just like the stories that you would tell and share, and I would love for you to share just like a little glimpse into what life was like for you as you were growing up, and what were some of the things that led to where you're at now, and especially when you first started getting into um forging and sword making and working with Peter Swarsbert. Take it from here.
All right. Well, I mean, I grew up just running around in the woods and being crazy, and
Sure.
and I, one thing that happened early on in my life, and I'm sure it's a similar story for a lot of people that have kind of followed this path, or at least some of us anyway. Like I got really into Dungeons and Dragons. My older brother was playing, and I got like super into it, and then that translated into running around in the backyard with sticks and fighting, and then and then we upgraded to wooden dowels, and then too many people didn't want to play anymore because their fingers were getting crushed, so we put some like foam around them,
right?
And like and I ended up like doing a lot of like sword fighting kind of stuff in my backyard, and doing a lot of that LARPing kind of adventure thing, and that was me through high
throwing
school.
magic potions and spells.
Yeah, like hucking tennis balls and yelling magic missile. Right?
Magic missile.
But it was great, man. It was great for my creativity, and it's just kind of let everything go. When I was in high school, like I spent, I was an athletic kid, so I was running track and doing all that stuff. But
right.
If I wasn't doing that, I was building weapons, and I was sewing costumes, and I was writing adventures, and I created this whole system. My buddy and I created a whole system to go, and build stuff out in the woods, and then I'd invite my friends over and dress them in the clothes that I made and give them swords and send them on adventures.
So, okay,
Um,
so you were just, like, doing that on your own. There wasn't something you'd seen or heard somewhere else. You were just like, "Of course, if we're gonna do this, we just gotta make this stuff."
yeah, I mean, I'd heard that there were
That's
places, these mythical things that you could go to, but like I didn't
I
know,
got
and
you.
I'd never been to any, and so we made up our own fun.
I see.
So yeah, man,
Crazy.
and but yeah,
You
uh,
got tired of hitting people with foam swords, and you're like, "Let's get some real metal."
yeah. Well, eventually, I mean, so I was always interested in swords and knives and all that kind of stuff, right? I was
Okay.
always fascinated with it,
Right.
and we ended up, when I was in college, I was living in Boston the summer after my sophomore year. So it was in the summer of um,
Love.
2000,
Okay, okay.
and I took a class at the Museum School of Fine Arts in fine metalworking,
Okay.
and and so working with like silver and brass and copper and all that stuff, all of a sudden it was just like, I fell in love with metal. Like it was such an amazing, I would always made stuff, from all sorts of different types of materials. But this was the first really like metal thing that I made, where these like rings, and I made a little like cutlery set, and I was hooked. And at that point, I ended up, the actual stories, I was telling my parents how I was so excited about this and I wanted to do like more things like this. And the the funny part was that my mom actually found Peter Swarsberg, and got in
Oh,
touch with him
right.
and was like, hey, my son's interested in doing this stuff, can he come and work with you?
And
So
how did she do that? Did she see an article in
she
a
talked to
paper or,
somebody.
like, Google or
She talked to somebody who knew about him, and then she found him
Interesting.
and got in
Okay.
touch with him. And so then once I ended up going and working with him a little bit over, I think it was one of my like a winter break. Um,
Wait, you gotta back it up. So how did that work? She's
yeah,
like your mom's like, "My son is very interested in hitting metal."
yeah, pretty much.
How does that work? Yeah.
I guess I don't know. I wasn't there for that conversation. She just was like, "Hey,
Okay.
I got in touch with this guy and I set this up for you," because that's
Okay.
that's how awesome my mom is, right?
Your mom is pretty awesome, honestly. She's probably one of the coolest moms I ever met,
She's pretty great.
to be fair.
So, but so she set this up, and then after that, once I started working with Peter, I was hooked. I was like, this is amazing. So, what we ended up doing was, I, one advantage of being in college is that they have all sorts of grant money and everything that they want to give to their
Right.
students.
Sure.
So as long as you go and ask for it, and so I went and I asked for it, and I was like, hey, I want to go and work with a blacksmith, and they were like, cool, here's a bunch of money for the summer. So
Sweet.
I didn't have to go back to my job at Hollywood Video, and
Oh, wow. Hollywood Video. That is a
right,
throwback. I
right,
remember renting, like, Mortal Kombat and all kinds of crazy movies from Yeah.
yeah,
Walking around.
man. That was when the
Um,
Dreamcast first came out, and
yeah.
anyway, uh,
So when you first started with Peter, what did he have you do? Like, he's like, "Haha, I have a minion now, and he can sweep all the floors," or did he put you straight to work?
he just
I
let me
mean,
fuck
obviously,
around.
you've been going to school and learning some skills.
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, none of it really applied. I mean, I was doing like all sorts of art classes and everything, right? So, I had, an art basis to come from this,
Sure.
come towards this, but I didn't have any like metalworking except for that one class that I had taken.
Right.
And and Peter was awesome, and he just really let me kind of like mess around and
That's great.
build stuff. And so then I practiced welding with this like little like crappy MIG welder, and I would go through the scrap bin and I'd build all these little like sculpture, like, warrior things.
I see.
And then we'd set them up and we'd have a catapult and knock them down. And
I there
so
was
I was
one
a
of
big
those on the
instructor.
mantle, right?
What's that?
There was one of those on the mantle in the office, right? Did you make that
there
living?
there might have been, but uh, no, I think that all those little dudes ended up getting tossed at some point,
Oh, perfect.
tossed into the scrap bin. Oh, oh, the scrap bin of time. It eats so many things,
Right.
right? But yeah, and then I started, started making knives and everything, and it was just, I was just hooked, man. It was
Interesting.
great.
So he's like, just don't burn the place down and don't cut your hand off.
Yeah, pretty much. I did one at one point.
Uh-oh.
Uh,
Did you
you
have a
know,
boo-boo?
no, no. What happened was I was really tired because I was probably out way too late the night before,
Sure.
right? And I was using the MIG welder.
Studying, right? Studying?
Oh, sure, yeah,
Of
studying,
course.
studying, um,
Always.
and studying mixology. It's a very important art,
Sure.
right?
It's like
Um,
chemistry, right?
yeah, it's very related, and I had a towel over my legs because I was wearing shorts and I was welding, and I was kind of like falling asleep while I was
Oh
welding.
my god.
Which how you do that, I don't really know. But then I
You're
wake
really
up,
tired is how that
you know,
works.
and I'm like start to like realize that like the towel is now on fire, like sitting in my lap.
Well, I see. So because you were wearing shorts, you're like, "Oh, a terry cloth towel is the perfect thing to protect myself with."
Well, maybe not the perfect thing, but it was the available thing.
I see. So you must have been
Yeah.
MIG welding then,
Yes. Yeah.
splattering everywhere or stick.
Yeah. Some
Um,
plus core MIG welding is good stuff right there.
tasty. Oh yeah, smoky and poppy and everything. Okay, so you're working and you're kind of during that summer, you're kind of playing around a bit. So when do things t- kind of go in a quote unquote more serious direction where because you and Peter worked together for a long time doing metal fabrication and installations and stuff like that. So when do things start getting a little bit more serious?
Well, once I graduated, um, so I graduated in 2002, and then I continued working out of Peter's shop, and he was very gracious to put up with me, and eventually, it turned into, um, we were making all. Trying to make ends meet. Everybody was kind of struggling at that point a bit,
Sure.
um, and we ended up finding Matt Parkinson. He took a class from Peter, and that's how that connection happened. Um, I think it was over in Brookfield. But anyways, the point is that the three of us then got together, and then we made Falling Hammer Productions. Right, Dragon's Breath was originally Peter's business,
Right.
and we all came together and made Falling Hammer Productions, and then we started doing like Renaissance fairs and stuff like that, selling our work there, and started doing ironwork stuff, and then that's where the divide came because we were we were having a hard time making the divide of Falling Hammer and Dragon's Breath. Because we
Okay.
were having a hard time. Like people go to your website and I'm like, oh, I want to buy a sword. What's this railing thing? And people are like, I want to buy a railing.
That
Well,
doesn't
why
look like a
battle
sword.
axe? You know.
Right.
So we split the two. Dragon's Breath for the swords and knives and stuff, and then Falling Hammer for the ironwork. And then the ironwork started taking off, and it was still a big struggle. I had to have a second job for a lot of the time.
Sure.
A lot of rice and beans and all that.
Still working
But
at Hollywood Video off and on?
I moved on from Hollywood Video.
Oh, okay.
But
What were
yeah,
some of your
no.
side hustles while you're doing that
I mean, I was
early
a
on?
waiter for a little bit.
Okay.
Um,
I could see you
I-
being a good front of house person.
yeah, it was yeah. So I was a waiter, and that was like all right. Um, but and then I like the main job that I had for 3 or 4 years was I was a teaching assistant at a school
Right.
for kids with mental and social disorders,
Right.
um, and so that was really challenging.
I believe
To
it.
Yeah,
I
it
can
was
imagine
pretty.
that being mentally and emotionally exhausting.
Oh, 100%.
And
Yeah.
physically. And
Yeah.
then going to your day job or your whatever, you know, the job that you really wanna do that doesn't pay as well. Like,
Yeah.
that's passion for the work.
Yeah. And it was
Yeah,
it was tough, man. It was long days. Um, but sticking through it, and then kind of it finally came out the other end, and our ironwork business like exploded, and we were doing work for these ridiculous houses, you know, and then also just tons of smaller stuff, because there's
sure.
there's not if anybody needs a side hustle, start making
Mhm.
railings, right? Because
Sure.
people aren't doing custom railings. Like we don't even have a website up, and uh like as early as for years, we haven't been doing ironwork, and you
Yeah.
know as recently as like last fall, somebody like drove up and was like, "Hey, do you guys make railings?" I'm like, "How do you even know we're here?" Right? Um,
Probably like
so
Yahoo or something like that.
yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know, but yeah, there's a huge demand for that kind of work, and
Sure.
it can pay really, really well. But
Right.
once we started getting successful enough with the swords and knives and everything, just didn't. Nobody really wanted to make railings, so like
Right.
slowly
That
everybody
paid
was
the
like
bills.
dropping. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
But once you can pay the bills with another means, that's kind
Yeah.
of where we all moved.
What was your so you're kinda getting into you're doing more swords and blades. What was, in your head, kinda like the first real big project that to you was like that signified like a transition for you? Like, I'm not just a guy that's fucking around with this stuff and messing with it. Like, I'm a legit sword maker now.
Hmm. Ooh, that's a very interesting question. Um, it's I'm trying to so you know it's interesting trying to think back that far into swords and things, um, and um, and and the transition would probably be um, like the when we started doing commissions as opposed to just making stuff for like Ren fairs like on
I
spec,
see.
right?
Yeah.
And that's when like the shift of that's where the shift of like um, you know to like we're really make like this is really working. This is like
Right.
we're making it here.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and um, a lot of that shift, honestly, not that I hadn't been doing swords beforehand and had done a couple commissions, but that big shift happened actually after Fortune Fire.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
yeah, because up until then, while we were on Fortune Fire, I was still, um, we were still doing ironwork, right? I was also apprenticed to a farrier at that point, and so I was doing horseshoeing. Um, I was making armor. I was doing jewelry work, doing a little bit of casting stuff, sculptural
Sure.
stuff, and the swords and knives and stuff. So I was like, at that point in my life, I was like, I'm gonna do everything, right?
I'm gonna do it
Um,
all.
I
Yeah.
will do it all, which, for a period of time is great because it gives you an understanding of how these other things are done and a respect for those people doing that. And also, like some of those techniques and things you can bring in interesting and surprising ways into, all the other things that you're doing.
Sure.
Um, so, but yeah, after Fortune Fires, when I switched over to really doing more just like into the swords and everything. And the amount of swords that I've made since then has been kind of crazy, I think.
Right.
Maybe not crazy. It feels like it's crazy.
I feel like you've made a lot of swords since then.
Yeah. And so
Like
here's
lots
another
of
crazy thing,
swords.
right? Lots of swords. Uh, and here's the other crazy part is that the sword that I made for the final for Forge and Fire was only the third piece of Damascus that I had ever made.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Well,
it
that worked
was.
out great.
It did, right? It was like because I remember I was talking with Peter about it, um, you know, and I was like, well, if I get to the final, what do you know? And he's like, well, you make what you want to do, like what you want to make in the future, you should make for your
That
final
is
project,
those are wise words.
right? And
'Cause
so,
y
and since
because if
then, it's just been
Right,
madness.
right, because 'cause you're just gonna probably people are gonna see that thing and they're like, "I want that." A lot of
Yeah,
people are yeah.
I've made a ton of gladius since then.
You've made a lot of really beautiful gladiuses for sure.
Oh, thanks, man.
So so that takes us to 2000 and 2015, 2014, 15. So our episode came out early August of 2015.
Mm,
And we filmed. I remember the first block of filming because when you go on the show, you film like the first 2 rounds, and then you go home to your home forge. So the first 2 rounds happened on Cinco de Mayo weekend, and I remember playing skee ball, and we met up with some friends of yours,
mm.
and a lot of alcohol being drank, and
Yeah.
which was fun. We had a good time. Um, but yeah, so that was 2000 May 2015. We're filming the show. That's how you and I meet.
Hmm.
I lose. Sorry, everybody. Spoiler alert. I should have said that first. I lost the episode. It was you and myself, Adam Eisen, and Ma- uh,
Maxon.
Maxon. I wanted for some reason I wanted to say Masonian Max, but it was Maxon. And
Yeah.
I feel like Maxon just is Maxon. Does he have a last name? I can't remember.
He does. I have no idea what it is.
So you and I make it to the final round though. And
Hmm.
and you beat me. I actually was watching because I was what was it last night I posted up on my Instagram like a last call for questions, and I was trying to find a picture of you and me together, and I was like, oh, YouTube has this thing where we like they're doing just the final testing, like just the final round, all the like the
Oh, okay.
on YouTube, and so I took a couple stills from there and I picked from those, and that's what I ended up
Yeah,
using.
you look
But
so young.
I know. I was like, wow, that is not me anymore. I feel like that is a different person. I feel like I'm looking at like my brother or something like that. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
like my younger brother.
Yeah. But that was fun. It was a wild I don't know. It wasn't necessarily traumatic, but it was a wild experience for sure. And I
Yeah,
think we bonded and got along, and the other guys too. I don't really keep in contact with the other guys. Nothing personal against them. I just haven't. Um and but you and I have always kept in contact, especially since a couple of years later I ended up joining Dragon's Breath Forge, or maybe
yeah.
only a year later. I can't remember. A
I
couple of
think it was
years later.
2 years. Yeah,
Yeah. But yeah, we go through. It's like I always called it like Forge and Fire camp, because like I feel like
yeah.
when you go to camp, like you meet all these people and do all these crazy things. You're out of your element, but it's also an opportunity for you to kind of reinvent yourself, or present yourself in a way that you might in maybe a more authentic way than you might not be comfortable doing in your normal everyday life. At least that's how I feel about camps and stuff like that. And
Mm,
and then you're sharing that experience with other people. So we have this shared yeah, and there's bonding that happens in it, and yeah, and we you and I got along great, and then
yeah, man. I
yeah.
wish that we could get the audio of like all of the audio that they took, because we were like singing songs off set and everything like that.
Oh yeah,
Like, do you
because they're
remember that?
taking audio the whole time. They're probably like,
Yeah.
"Ugh, get rid of this
Like,
shit."
what is
It's
going
just
on with
went
these
straight into
guys?
the straight onto the cutting room floor. And they're just like, "Get rid of all this crap." Um, I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, and that was my first time to New York City and to the East Coast, actually.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I thought I had a great time and had a fun experience, and I that will always be a very positive thing for me. And then what is it? It wasn't that year, it was after our episode aired. I think the following year in 2016, I came out and visited you guys at Dragon's Breath Forge after Blade Show the following year.
Hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and I road tripped back with you guys. Yeah, it was you and Peter and
Yep.
Michael. We drove back, and then I spent what? I was there for a week or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. It was probably a week. Yeah.
Yeah, and we just kind of fucked around in the shop, and we made some steel, but mostly we were just messing around in the shop. And I felt like Peter was super annoyed by me. And I think even when I recall the story to him, he's like, "Yeah, I was definitely annoyed." And so, but at the end of all that, you were like, "Hey, if you ever want to move to Connecticut, there's a shop for you. You know, there's a shop here for you to work in." And and it just happened that at that time at my shop back here in Turnwater, Washington. That's a joke. On Fortune Fire, they kept getting the name of my city wrong. They kept spelling it Turnwater instead of Tumwater. Anyways, that's not a very good story. Anyhow, um,
It's
they
very funny.
great, good. Um, I was getting kicked out of my building, and I probably could have found something that worked around here, but for me, um, there were and I so we probably could have made something work here in Olympia area, somewhere in Washington. Um, but I jokingly said to my wife the same way you said to me, "Oh, we can just move to Connecticut and I can join Dragon's Breath Forge." And then a light went off in her head and she's like, "Let me do some numbers." And so she found that it would basically be the same for us to live there as it was here. Of course, there's the cost of moving, but um, there were more opportunities out there, not only to work with you guys in that communal shop and to learn from you guys, but also just so many other makers over on the East Coast that I'd never really met or got to spend time with. Um, and I had clients in New York and then the East Coast as well. So if it just felt like going east was a good move, and it was fun, and we did a lot of cool stuff. I feel like
Yeah.
I did a ton of steel exploration and experimentation, and especially having access to those power hammers that you've recently actually just got revamped with the help of
Yeah.
Mr. Mark Kraus, right?
Mark Krause was out here for 3 weeks.
Sure.
The Samac is like not at all the same hammer. Like, he like ripped out all the insides, was like, don't need this, don't need that. That part was dumb. And now it's working amazingly.
Nice.
Uh, and then the 4B just had a ton of work that needed to be done.
Sure.
Things, I mean, it's 100 and I think Mark thinks it was made in like 1919
Oh
or
wow.
somewhere around there.
Yeah. So
So
just
it's
over 100
over
years.
100 years, and man, there was a lot of loving that hammer needed. So
Sure. Didn't you say
uh,
somewhere around the down the road, somebody decided to make modifications to the 4B, right? Because they thought it wasn't getting enough oil or something, and they just
oh yeah, up
messing
up with
things
like
up.
the front cylinder was like they gouged a big old like line down the front cylinder, and so like air was just flying through. But I don't know, it was linked to one of the oil ports. It's right near one of the oil ports, so it was probably to try to get oil to flow through it, but it was a terrible idea. So,
Yikes.
you know, up there with an angle grinder, like dovetailed that, and like lead into that whole thing and scraped it down, and
Wow.
working much better now.
That's great.
was,
Oh my gosh. I
but
can't even
it was an
imagine.
intense 3 weeks, man.
Did you guys get much footage of some of the repair work going on? Because I know I didn't see much regarding posting
Yeah,
until just when like Mark was, I think, getting ready to leave or something like that. But I could also imagine that you guys were super busy just helping make that all happen, and that there
yeah.
might not have been
There's
time to really take. Let's get a selfie.
yeah. I mean, there was some time lapse taken of putting it back together,
Okay.
um, and and I did take did do I don't know, took some pictures, but at that point I was kind of like, one of the difficulties is that you know working on that hammer, um, the 4B was disgusting. Like
Oh, sweet.
it was 100 Years of Funk is an awesome name for an album,
100
but
years of fun.
like it's terrible to work in.
Just all kind of gunk and oil and
Oh,
grease
uh,
and
yeah, it was disgusting. Like everything was covered in grease and oil, and you'd go home and you'd be like all the way up your arm, just like you thought you
ugh.
got everything. You missed the spot like right in here, and it was disgusting.
You need one
Everything
of those
needs.
skin scraper.
Yeah, and you need somebody to get all the spots you can't see. You so yeah, man. It was it was good to gain a better understanding on how that hammer
Sure.
works, right? So that was awesome. It was amazing to see Mark like be like, oh well, we need to make this thing happen. And then 10 minutes later, he's made the tool to do the thing. He's an
Oh, wow.
incredibly knowledgeable person and an incredibly skilled smith. He does a lot of like really cool sculptural stuff.
Yeah.
That if you haven't seen the actual like, because I think that most people think about Mark and they're like, oh yeah, he's the guy, he's the hammer whisperer. He just like fixes
Right.
hammers and stuff. But like his forging skills are on point. He's a very talented smith.
Nice.
So it's something interesting to keep in mind.
For sure. He's on Instagram, by the way, as he's
Yes.
at hammer_whisperer. And yeah, it shows mostly hammer stuff. I do see some
Yeah.
of his forging work, but yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure how much of that stuff he like shares to a lot of the world. I mean, he was showing me on
Yeah.
his phone a lot of these
I got you.
sculptures done. Um, but yeah, it's an interesting dude.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm glad you guys got
Yeah.
those tuned up.
Yeah, man, they
Because I
needed it.
know they were working. I'm very intrigued because I'm gonna actually be out there in October, right? Late October.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so I'll be intrigued to see what they feel like and how they drive differently and control and all that kind of stuff. It'll be
Yeah.
interesting. Have you
Absolutely.
guys what kind of changes are you gonna have going forward? Are you gonna use the same kiss block system, or are you gonna do something different? Um,
Oh, for well, we haven't been doing much with the kiss blocks. Like
okay,
so, we kind of stopped that. I mean that had really ended up being pretty tough on the hammer,
yeah,
on the guides and everything.
yeah,
So what we've been doing, or what I've been doing, is I've been forging really close to shape, to the size that I'm looking to get. Um, very carefully forging, and then going over to the press
to
and
get final
pressing down to
dimension.
my final dimensions. Yeah.
That's a good move. Yeah,
Yeah.
that way too. Yeah. There's just yeah. Cool. That's a good move.
So
Nice.
speaking of like resizing stuff, like this is the thing that
Okay.
I've been thinking about,
All
right?
right, let's hear it.
So, uh, so as you're forging down shapes, you
Yes.
forge out, you make whatever pattern, right, in your bar,
Okay.
and as you're bringing it down, it is incredibly difficult to not get like distortion because it's easy to go a little
Yep.
bit far this way, and then that changes it,
Yep.
and it's never going to go back, right?
For
Forging it
sure.
back this way doesn't make it the same,
Yep.
right? Um, so like, what if you set up like if you had a press set up like squaring dies, right?
Yes.
Top and bottom squaring dies that were like a 16th different, like just
Oh
diminished in
yeah.
sizes, right?
That is definitely the way to go. If you have
Yeah,
that ability.
yeah.
Especially if you're working with square stock. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think that what would be most ideal is to have a set of squaring dies that are as big as what, 2.5, maybe 3 inches even, and be able to consistently reduce it down, um, all the way even down to like half-inch stock, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But it helps prevent like the twisting and the kicking off and all the awkward shit that just happens either under a press or
And
under a
yeah,
hammer.
yeah. I mean, because it's so easy for patterns to like. It doesn't matter how freaking careful you are,
No,
right?
it
When you're
doesn't.
reducing down, right?
Yeah,
Like it just you just get that distortion,
yeah.
you know.
Even just the slightest little, like, either dishing on your hammer or forging dies, whether it's the press or the hammer, or even, like, on my press, when it comes down, it like, comes down, and then when it makes contact with the material, it goes, "Brrr," and then it makes contact, and it shifts just the slightest little bit,
Mm,
but every time it's coming down, and then it kicks over, that's slowly taking my square stock and making it a parallelogram because it's
yeah.
gently just kicking it over every time, and especially if I'm working it from the same side every time. So I've actually started working, especially under my press, working without handles or short stub handles, so that I can flip the work around, and then also if it's gonna kick over, because it's gonna happen, I know it's gonna happen,
Yeah, yeah.
then
So the stub handle
take
on either side.
yeah, taking that into
Yeah.
consideration and working it from either way. Often I don't actually have a handle on on the bar, especially if it's starting stock is around like inch and a quarter or something, or I'll
Mm,
reduce it down to a point, and then I'll cut the handle off, and then I'll work it down until I can hold it with a pair of tongs, basically.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
do not have a very wide variety of tongs. I need to up my tong game. I'll tell you what. But that makes a big difference in working that stuff down. But I think also part of the distortion that occurs happens when you're crushing the material and it pooches out, right? And
hmm,
whatever work,
absolutely, 100%.
if you can work more with
Push it down
drawing,
from all four sides.
right?
Yeah,
Well, yeah. Well, it's pooching down from all 4 sides, but if you don't have squaring dies, if you work as much as you can with some sort of drawing dies, that will help get you the reduction you need with less pooch out.
oh
Um
yeah,
It'll still, depending on the radius of the die, or I guess the radius like this, that'll be more useful if I
mm,
do it. If it's a tight radius versus a gentle radius, that will probably inform how much it pooches out on the sides, but you will get less. It'll occur less.
mm,
But the issue of stuff getting off square is still a problem. And so I think
yeah,
squaring dies going forward, I really need to get a hold of a solid set of squaring dies, at least the largest ones. Because if you get a large set of squaring dies, the jaws, then you can make your own
sure,
shims that sit
yeah,
inside. They like basically like Russian nesting dolls, and they nest within each other, and you can shim it out to whatever you size you need.
yeah. Yeah, and then but then the part on that is that if you have too many things going in there, the likelihood of those things shifting on each other ends up being
Sure, if you
more.
do it right though, like that top die should help kind of keep everything captured.
Yeah.
But yeah, the more moving parts, the more potential of an issue. You are 100%. Um, cool. So I'm glad that you got those hammers tuned up. I bet that's got to be great for you guys.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's only been had like a week, maybe half. Right? Yeah, it's been about a week that we've had them all
Right.
like functional again. So yeah, man, I got a lot of things in the pipeline, a lot
Yeah.
of really interesting things floating through my brain
Yeah.
to get made under the cameras.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Jamie and I talk a lot on the phone. Probably not as much as actually we should. We should talk more frequently. Um,
I think so.
but often our conversations gravitate. We start out talking about family, and you got a sweet little boy, and so do I, and so it's interesting watching them grow up and become their own little people and
Mm,
stuff. But we always end up gravitating towards Damascus and talking about Damascus patterns and stuff like that. And the reason you're part of the artist, I wanted you to be part of this podcast, but also part of my Artisans of Steel calendar. This year's theme was Damascus, and not only pioneers but innovators in the craft and the, I guess, I don't even call it like the subgenre, because it can be its own thing, just making the Damascus, right?
oh,
Um,
sure.
and
Yeah, I mean, it's a skill set of its own, right? Like
yes.
you could make beautiful Damascus and not know how to make a knife,
Yes, I've seen
right?
those. I've seen vice versa too. I've seen really
Or
great
be able to
knives
make a
and
beautiful
dog
knife.
shit Damascus. So, um, but what I really admire about what you're doing, is especially the mosaic swords that you've been doing in over the last what shit, like 3, 4 years almost now, but you've really, like, that's become your lane in a way. You still
Mm,
do your multi-bars, which are, like, reversing twists and kinda more traditional, like, Viking pattern welded sword style stuff too, but you're
mm,
definitely playing a lot more in the mosaic Damascus sword realm more than anybody else I'm aware of, if not being basically the only person who does mosaics. I mean, I'm sure there are other people who have made mosaic Damascus swords, but that's not their thing. And it is
mm.
definitely your thing. And honestly, I as crazy as it sounds, like the ancient Romans from a period for about a 300-year period from and this is, this, Jamie, but a lot of people don't. But basically from 100 of somewhere between 50 to 100 AD to about 450, 500 AD. So I guess that maybe that's a wider range than I was thinking. 3 to 400 year range. The Romans were making tiled mosaic pattern welded swords, and it started
Yeah,
from Celtic tradition that was making pattern welded blades as far back as 500 BC, which is kind of fucking crazy to think about. And that's a
yeah.
long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah. The first guy that was like, you know what? Like, because they were layering stuff before that, right?
Right.
You know, and you look at it and you can see because they were like consolidating different billets and,
Yep.
you know, uh, and then there was one dude that was just like, but dude, what if we twist
No, he's probably like he's
it?
probably like, after he eats the mushrooms, like, bro, what if we yeah, for sure. And then somebody's crazy brain just took it and ran with it, and it's just become a thing. And part of that was also to kind of mix the materials up in a way, in a meaningful way that also not only was aesthetically pleasing, but actually served a function in the sword because it did help
Sure.
mix up the layering of those steels so that um, you had a variability basically of hardness and toughness throughout the blade. And so
Mm,
they definitely served a function. But in the ancient Roman Empire, not only was the Roman Empire basically coming to an end at that time at around 450 or 500 AD, right? You know more about Roman history, but I
I
think
mean,
steel
it all depends
technology
on,
was changing.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, it all depends on where you want to mark the end of the Roman Empire
Sure.
and a whole different conversation.
Right. So technology was also changing, um, and I think, I think one of my conversations I had with Peter Swarsberg was that Peter, like, steel technology was just changing and was just getting better, honestly, more than anything.
Hmm.
And so a transition was made from ornamenting the sword to making the blade or the handle or the hilt and the scabbard very ornamental and doing all kinds of metal inlay. But then then the steel on the blade was not as exciting. And I think part of that is not only was the steel technology changing and you could get better material without doing a shit ton of work, but the making those mosaic tile swords especially was a
Hmm.
tremendous amount of work, especially hit in 300 AD.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
obviously they're very talented, and I think a lot of people underestimate people from those times, but they were because they were doing some astonishing work. Um,
Yeah.
but it was still incredibly labor intensive. Like there was somebody's lifetime of work went into maybe making just a handful of swords, probably, right?
Well, I mean, it's hard to quantify. I mean, like I'm sure you hear stories about, oh, took like a year to make a sword. And like, how is it going to take you a year to make a sword? And then but take away your power hammer, take away your grinder. Here's some iron ore. Let's go.
No, no, no. You didn't even start.
Right.
You got to go dig it up first. Some people.
Yeah.
You're not
Well,
just
yeah.
buying that at
Yeah.
the grocery
But
store.
I mean,
Yeah,
and yeah, you know, during Roman times you had like markets and things where you could go and get iron, and you'd have these blocks that were like pierced and
oh,
drifted so that you
interesting.
could see the quality of them, right? So like, oh, this is how this one pierces this one. They have different thicknesses, and you could say, all right, well, I want this
Right.
steel and I want this steel, or this iron, and then you could take that. I mean, that not everybody had access to that market, right?
Sure.
But but generally the guy smelting was probably not the guy that was making the sword, right?
Sure.
All of that stuff was broken down into people. Probably the guy making the blade was probably not the guy making the handle,
Yeah, several
right?
hands on a single
You know,
project, right?
yeah. I mean, if you look, one of the interesting things is like we know so little about how all that was done. We only have a few little artifacts here and there. It's like you know. Sword fighting, long sword fighting in European style longsword, right? We have some manuscripts that have stills, but there's no lineage of like people continuing to practice how to use a longsword,
Sure.
right? It's not like katanas. It's not like Japanese martial arts. That's the thing that's been you have a continuous line that's passed down. This is how it goes, right? We're trying to reconstruct it from these bits and pieces that we have.
Right.
So yeah, we have some swords. Oh, we have some manuscripts. But those manuscripts are just like stills. And
A
how do
couple
you
illustrations.
interpret how do you turn that into an actual sword fight?
Right.
You know? Um, how were they actually making these swords? We don't have records of it. Like
No,
nobody
because
was writing that down.
one, they probably didn't have the education to do it. I'm sure they could have found somebody if they really wanted to,
Well,
but
it's like
it
state
was
secret, man. It's like
trade
it
secrets,
was the height of
exactly.
technology.
Yeah.
It was the height of technology. So why would you want to put that in a place where somebody could come in and steal it,
Right.
right?
Yeah, so it's an oral
Uh,
history passed down for all those years. And
yeah.
honestly, like 300 years is what? Uh, like 6 guys?
Well, yeah. I mean, I mean, probably. Who knows how long
6 to
a
8?
Smith actually lived that in that time period though, because you're also gonna have like overlap, right?
Sure.
So like
Right, right, right.
probably
Yeah, so maybe it was
12,
maybe yeah, yeah, 12 people.
maybe Smith until you're 50. Like that'd be pretty old.
Until
I think
your lungs are
40.
full of coke smoke
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
Ugh.
I got the black lung again.
Nancy. Bring my bellows. Can't do this on my own. uh, sorry, I don't know why I just turned into that guy. So the reason I bring all that up is
Hmm.
because they were doing a tremendously complicated mosaic damascus pattern welded. I almost said panty welded. Pattern welded swords that
Hmm.
long ago. And to
Hmm.
me, I feel like nobody has really been doing that on a consistent basis until you. So there's, you know, almost 2,000-year gap between the Romans doing this kind of work and now you doing this kind of work on a, like I said, on a consistent basis and doing it well and making legitimate tools, not just something that's pretty, right?
Hmm.
And I think then that was for me, that was a big reason why like I had to have you in the calendar because people are going to be finding the work that you're doing and they're going to be like, how the hell was this guy doing this in 2020? um and so yeah, I don't know. I think the work that you're doing is really incredible and
Thank you.
inspiring, honestly, and super. Obviously it's I mean I think it's super creative. You're creating a lot of really interesting patterns and on an unusual palette. Like I said, like basically nobody was doing any consistent work in mosaics on swords, but swords are a long palette. But then you also have to think about, you don't start with like a 3 inch by 4 inch block that's like an inch and a half thick and then stretch that out. Like
Yeah.
taking some very thoughtful steps and in considerations into, if this is what the pattern looks like now, what's going to happen when I stretch it out to 2 or 3 times this length? And then packing that
Yeah.
material down to properly open back up, basically, in a way. And yeah, super challenging work. And I'm sure, God, you've had some seriously involved pieces that you've had to scrap, sadly, after hours and
Mhm.
hours of work. And it's painful, but it's also kind of like what people would say is like paying your dues or bladesmith tuition or swordsmith tuition, if you want to call it that, for the
Sure.
education and the understanding of these processes.
Yeah. Well, you learn a lot through failure, right? You know, I
If you're
mean,
paying
and
attention, you do.
yeah,
Hopefully.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not learning when you're failing, you're doing it wrong.
I can't remember who said it. I can't remember who coined this term, but they call it failing up. And so you made a
Hmm.
mistake, you failed, fucked up, got to start over. But if you fail up, that means you learn something, and next time around, you're not going to make that mistake again.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Those wise words right there.
So,
Absolutely. But yeah, man. I mean,
so I guess sorry, let me
you
cut you off real quick. So part
okay?
of me bringing all that up is like I would love to hear about um kind of your journey when you first started these mosaic Damascus swords and some of the, you get into as much or little detail as you feel comfortable with, but some of the journey, how you got started in trying to do these and doing them more consistently, some of the hurdles, and also like it'd be interesting to. I have some pictures of swords that you've made that I'll pop up onto the screen so we can kind of talk about some of the creative process too. Um,
Sure.
as to like what inspired, what were you trying to accomplish with some of these patterns as well? Kind of a critique. We're gonna critique a little bit, but more of a conversation,
Yeah,
not really a critique.
absolutely. Sounds good, man. Well, yeah. Well, let's see what you got.
Well, I wanted to first hear about some of sorry, because I just rattle off a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Yes. So the start of you going down this rabbit hole of building these mosaic swords and some of the challenges
Okay.
along the way. Um,
Yeah. So
yeah,
the first challenge was, and we spent a lot of time talking about this. You and I and Peter, we spent a lot of time looking back at those swords from Ilrup and Nidem,
yeah,
and like how did they put these together? Because there's we think about um, how we traditionally do our pattern weldings,
sure,
right? And how do you put together something with like a butt weld, right? Have two square tiles or rectangular tiles coming in and touching and not compressing in that direction,
sure.
right? You can't, because you have a long piece. A lot of the billets that I start with are 12 or 14 inches long,
Oh
right?
wow.
So I start out with a long billet, and so how do you get it all to weld without compressing end to end,
Right.
right? Um, and we spent a long time looking at things and contemplating that, um, and I put together a short sword, just to see if I could, and I was able to make that work, right? Uh, and I don't really, and so I don't know how they were doing it back in the day, um, because they didn't have a TIG welder to, like,
What?
put, like, okay, this piece stays here, you know.
They didn't have a TIG welder?
They didn't have TIG welds. I know, it's crazy.
That's astonishing.
Um, but so I've put a lot of thought into, like, trying to, you know, what if we could try to recreate, you know, how, like, with the tools of the time, could we recreate some of those patterns, or at least some of the welds, right?
Sure.
I mean, um, and because once you get into to that final assembly, things get janky and weird, man. I mean, if you have
Yeah.
if you have such a long piece, how do you get it all to see together? And were they welding it all one tile at a time? I mean, maybe. That
That'd
seems
be a
crazy to me.
lot. Yeah, that'd be so inefficient
Um,
and so much cleanup work.
right? But maybe that's what a lot of people, when I bring this up to people, they're like, "Oh, well, just weld it one tile at a time." Like, well, how do you do that? How do you do that without distorting the crap out of each tile,
Yeah.
right?
Yowza.
You know, um,
What a nightmare.
and so my thought was that, because when you look back at these patterns, a lot of them have long bars that that are on either side of the tiles, right?
Yep.
And so, one thought that and I'm not sure if it was me that came up with it or if it was you or Peter. Honestly, like, I claim credit for it. It was
It was
like
me.
it spawned.
I'm just
It was
joking.
it was
I don't even know what the idea is
uh,
that you're about to explain, but it was definitely me.
but if you make
Just
your
joking.
your I call them rails, like, so the long
Okay.
long bars, I'll refer to as rails, right? So if your rails are narrower, not as thick as your tiles, when you put everything together, right? um in modern times here, I'm using a TIG welder to kind of make sure things don't shift around on me, so I can
Sure.
place that rail, like, in the middle of those tiles, um, and then you weld it from the sides first, and then come aggressively down on it. Those rails are stuck to the sides of the tiles. They can't move. The tiles can't move because they're welded.
Right.
They have to expand some way. And like we were talking about earlier, you get that pooching effect when you forge aggressively from one side. They will pooch out into each other, and that would make the weld, right? And so that's how the first sword came together, or the first short sword. That was like the proof of concept of being able to do a longer weld without, welding up a mosaic without end to end welding.
Right.
Um, so that was my first adventure in that. Um, Now I see stuff that that Salem has done, and I'm pretty sure that he just leaves everything the same thickness and just compresses in it, and it also welds that way.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
and I think a key, especially in our modern times and the materials that we're working with, is like cleanliness makes a big difference in how well things stick together. Not necessarily how tight
yeah,
they are. Tightness helps, but
yeah,
how clean they are. Or at least I've been
yeah,
finding lately. And
yeah,
struggling actually with some billets because I was kind of slacking on the cleanliness, trying to test how far I actually could push it, and I found where too far was too far, and I had
yeah,
some
yeah.
failures.
Because I don't go super long.
Yeah,
Um, well, I don't go super clean um, on all of my tiles. I try to get them pretty clean, right?
yeah,
But at a certain point, you might be chasing a little spot and then grind into your pattern in a way that you don't want to,
right,
right?
yeah,
So, and we're both doing like fluxless welding,
yeah,
right? And so, putting like creating the space to have the decarb that you get from heat and creating that carbon rich environment, to creating the space to capture that carbon,
yeah,
um, and clean up that steel, because carbon is a prolific bonder. It is
yes,
the most promiscuous element on the periodic table, I believe, and it really
promiscuous. I
likes
like that.
oxygen.
The most promiscuous element.
Yeah, it's true, man. It's true. And it really, really likes oxygen. So when it comes up against those oxides, it really does clean up that steel.
Yeah,
Um, so I mean, part of it comes down to soak time, I think.
sure.
You know, um, so I
Cool.
don't know. How
Um,
long do you generally soak for?
allow the steel to soak for.
Yeah.
Um, in the first when it's the first few rounds of welding, like initial pattern welding, I don't soak for crazy long periods of time. Um, but usually on at least the first round of heat soaking, before I do my initial weld, I'll let it soak for 10-15 minutes.
Mm,
So once I bring the forge up to temperature, uh, and I got the steel up to temperature, then I'll actually kind of dial the temperature back just a little bit so it's soaking at a good temperature, but nothing crazy, um so that the carbon's able to do its thing and move
mm,
around. And that it's a carburized atmosphere. And then yeah, and then the first round I squish, 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 and then from there especially if I'm just reducing in height. I'm usually my billets are like 4.25 inches tall, and so that's quite a bit of height to reduce down from. So
how
that gives
how 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 thick are they?
how wide the
Yeah,
starting
yeah.
billets are. Yeah, so the starting billets, my starting billets nowadays are 5 inches long, 4.25 inches tall, and at least an inch and a quarter. But I think right now I have inch and a half material.
Mm.
Yeah. Um. Yeah. What do you have a follow up or comment?
I just no, I just so I and in a lot of in my final stacks, I'm working at like a half inch,
Sure.
um, you know,
You mean
and
for
I
your sword
I
billets?
did yeah, and I just did a really big sword that was like 4.5 inches tall, I think it was. half-inch wide and 8 inches long or something like that. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't super long. It was incredibly tall. I had like 126 pieces in that one.
Holy smokes.
Because that's one of the things is that, like, in a lot of these my final assemblies,
Mm-hmm.
I have like 100 or more pieces that I'm welding together,
Right.
um, which ends up being crazy. But it's how you preserve that pattern. I mean, it's a thing that we've talked about.
Right.
Like, you see these basket weaves that people build up, and unless you're making the basket weave in that final weld, you're never going to get it to. I say you never. It is incredibly difficult
Sure.
to get them to line up tile to tile.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, man.
I have some swords here
So, yeah,
for you to talk through. Let's see. We'll start with some of
sure.
the collaborations with
I
you and Mr. Matt Berry. It's
Yeah.
gonna be right over our
Yeah.
faces. And
Oh,
if you're only
nice.
listening to the podcast, you can go to YouTube, you can pull this up and check it out. But the work is phenomenal. Can you talk to me about what's happening in this piece?
Yeah, man. So this one is like definitely inspired from those Roman spatha, and I was looking at this, trying to build a pattern that was going to evolve down a blade.
Mm, sure.
And I think that, like, seeing that evolution, it's an interesting thing because it is unique. You don't see that a lot. A lot of people will do a pattern and stick to that for everything, and yeah, that pattern gets distorted as it gets drawn out to a taper or whatever else.
Yeah.
But with this guy, I have kind of like some palmette. You start out at the base, and I have
Here, I got a closer shot we
the
can look at. Oh, that's not the same sword. Sorry.
oh no, that is the same sword.
Is that the same sword?
That's just the center of it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Because
So
there's
let's
some
talk.
twisted bars that go down the center.
Right. Okay.
Um, but at the base you have those like kind of like Greek key shapes,
Mhm.
and that was one that I had constructed, as
Right.
opposed to doing like a jelly roll. That one was a constructed pattern,
Yeah.
um, and then yeah, built the kind of palmette patterns to go out. Um,
Kinda like these
Outside
key,
that
right?
center line. Oh yeah, so that's the same bar, right? So I made a big bar of it, and you'll see that a lot in my work. Like I build a pattern, and then it sits around, and I'm like, oh, I could use a little bit of it here, and a little bit
Sure,
there, and
sure.
you um, and yeah, and from here, then I'm trying to keep like a central line going that will connect everything together, even though the blade goes through stages of pattern
Mhm.
where, so you have that center line that goes through, and then I added two twisted bars on either side of it. So if you go to that picture that you showed the second time, that shows the core of it, right? So you get really deep into those twists, low layer twists,
Yeah.
um, and then have the palmettes going on the outside of that, and then those palmettes stop, and then it goes into straight lines, that then come together at a fish mouth tip.
Yeah.
So there was a lot going on with this blade.
It's interesting
It
just in
was
the
it was
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh no. It was kind of like one of the first of this mosaic, of first of like the mosaic blades that I really put out.
Okay. I was just gonna say it's interesting just how from the bottom right corner of this picture, how the twists even just change as you start to travel
Hmm.
up to the top left corner. Goes from being very vertical or tight and narrow, and then more towards what I would assume is towards the center of the bar. And then I don't know, it's just but it's consistent, and it's a cool variance in just that center element down the blade. I like that a lot.
Yeah, you know, that one came out. That one was really that was a really cool piece.
Yeah.
I had, you know, this was actually the second of that style blade that I did. I had done a first one, and what I had done in the first one was I took those like I wanted the central twists to be um, more of the outer part of the twist as opposed to the inner part of the
I
twist,
got you. Yeah.
to give more of like the wheat sheaf look, right?
Yeah.
And so I took that initial bar of twisted and I cut those twists in half and I flipped them inside out so that as I ground into the fuller, I would get
Mhm.
closer to the outside of the bar
Sure.
as opposed to the inside of the bar. Um, but that was one that had failed because that when I welded those, I had some flaws in that flipped, that flipped bar, and I was like, I'm either going to grind through this flaw or I'll grind through the bar or grind through the sword, and I ground through the sword.
Oh,
So
Jesus. Yeah.
time to start again.
Yay. It feels
Yay!
so good.
And then I was like, I'm going to go with the center part of a twist for this
Nice.
one.
Alright, we got another one here. This is a shorter Gladius style
Yeah. So
mosaic. I
that
feel like this
that
is a more recent
Gladius.
piece, right?
No, this one
No?
is
Okay.
still a while ago. This was 3 years ago,
Okay.
maybe ish. This one is actually in the Museum of Fine Art in Cyprus,
Whoa.
which is
That's
kind of
cool.
crazy and cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
In
yeah.
Cyprus. So wait,
Yeah.
did the museum reach out to you, or a curator from the museum, or a private collector, and then they had it placed in the
Yeah. As
museum?
a private collector bought a
Wow.
whole bunch of stuff from a lot of folks from like the first season of Fortune Fire, and then
Oh, not me. I guess they don't want any
sorry.
loser swords. Cool. All right, so you and your
Oh
private
well,
club of friends made these really cool swords, and they're in the Museum of Cyprus.
yeah. See, he put some of them in the museum and kept some of them for himself.
I gotcha.
Um, but this one was one that I built the pattern in there with more the mosaic portion of that pattern
Okay.
was definitely more of an exploration.
Mhm.
As I went through, I would kind of like do a manipulation, look at the bar, and then be like, oh, but what if I did this and what if I did that? And in the
Sure.
end, it kind of has this cool like turtle
Yeah,
look to it.
it does.
Um, which goes well with the kind of like wave motif on the handle.
Mhm.
But yeah, that handle is like stabilized spalted maple, moose antler, and silver, and then I just painted in the carved moose antler.
That's great.
But yeah, that was a really cool sword,
All
and
right.
that's the spalting on that maple was
Oh.
just like absurd.
Oh, yeah, dude, I can see it. There's, like, these massive black veins through it. It's crazy. It's
Yeah,
like marbling. All right, we got this axe.
yeah, this monster axe. This one, this got a lot of interest. This one actually ended up in Blade. It was like the back cover of Blade magazine.
Oh, nice.
Um, and and the fun part about this was, the original the layup of it was basically like a herringbone layup of twisted crushed W's.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Um, and then and once I kind of laid that out, again, like I was I was doing a lot of exploration at this point, and so I then did a that spike is 100 layers, I believe, or something close to that. That I then used like I crushed a 90 degree into a
Sure.
block of 100 layer, and then nested that up to the back of that herringbone, and then constructed the 1080 edge.
Crazy.
Yeah, and so I really love how that spike came out, right? Like it blends so well into everything,
Well, and it's
and then
nice that it's
cutting
its own
into it.
thing.
Yeah,
Sorry. Yeah.
yeah, but it blends, and part of that is like so like line density,
Yeah.
right? So there the line density makes it kind of meld into its own thing. You can see that transition, but it
Yeah.
doesn't look like stark, like the edge is. That it's a very stark change
Right.
to that 1080 edge.
Yeah.
So
Slick.
yeah, that was fun.
This is the piece that I put in the Artisans of Steel calendar. What do you call it
Mm,
again? Vine. Yeah. You go ahead. Describe this art.
flowering vine.
Flowering vine.
Yeah. Yes. So this one um, was inspired by Salem Straub. He had done a a flowering pattern um, that was basically like a grid of flowers,
Sure.
and he had done like a breakdown of how he built that on Instagram or Facebook or whatever where I saw it, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh man. And so one big thing that I do a lot in my work is I try to like take an element and
Sure.
uh and you know work with that as opposed to a whole like array of stuff, you
Yeah.
know um because there's a lot of space in here where I things could be more complicated and be more busy, right? But what makes this pattern awesome is just the simplicity of it. I mean, not
Sure.
that it's simple,
No.
but it's not super busy,
Right. No,
right?
it's
Uh,
making that conscious choice to not overload it and allow it to have the space to be elegant and flowing without all the extra distraction. Because, like you said, there is a lot of negative space that potentially could have been filled up with a bunch of other interesting patterns, but it wouldn't be as, I feel like, especially like have that across the room distinct. I gotta walk closer and check that out kind of quality to it.
yeah, yeah, and I've been thinking a lot more about this, and so the other part that I did, once I saw, this thing that Salem had done, the flower, you know, I added the stem to it, and then you use that to connect to your rails, and all of a sudden you have a pattern that flows down your whole blade,
Right.
right? And the same thing with the leaves attaching into that,
Yeah.
and yeah, and so then it was building that, and then leaving room on my borders so that I could put in the serpent um, that gives it the wave.
Trying to think.
Um,
I have
and
a
um,
picture
and yeah,
here that
I've been thinking a lot about these patterns. Yeah, there you go with the Michter's rye. That's some
yeah,
some good drinking right there.
I believe it.
But but that this so if you go back to that sword again, or
Yep.
the picture on there, yeah, I think that might have been the first version of it because I had to build that twice.
Oh,
Because
geez.
I broke it. I broke the first one in straightening it. Like
Oh,
I put some crazy flex on it.
yeah.
And I'm trying to tell because the way that you can tell is that the first one, the leaf didn't have a like it's not a variegation line, but like a center line on it,
I
right?
see.
And if you look at the picture that Coop took, you can see that line. And I don't think I see
Yeah, no, I
I don't
don't
think I
think I
see the
do
center.
either. So this is the first one.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah.
Hold
So that's the one that I broke.
Ouch. Well, you did a good
Yeah,
job putting it back
yeah.
together and doing the second
Thanks,
one.
thanks. Um, and it's one of those things where that was such a heartbreaking moment. But you end up learning stuff like when you're going to straighten a sword or a knife or anything, you got to make sure that if you temper it at you know 400 degrees when you go to do your bending, do it at 425 or 450. Because if you're, I was talking with Peter about this, and he was like, unless you're tempering at a higher and getting a higher temperature and getting some carbon migration and things going on there,
Yeah.
things are not going to straighten out. And that was it. It was like the bend. I think I have a picture of it where I have this crazy bend in the sword. Like
Oh
it
my
was like
god.
this,
I feel like I remember
right?
seeing that. You
And
posted it
and
on
and it just
Instagram,
wouldn't
right?
go. And I'm like, keep going and keep going. You got to go a little further. Got to go a little further. And then
Yeah.
it broke. And yeah. And then I probably
Ouch.
finished that bottle of Michter's.
They God damn it. Um So
But
something I also want to
yeah.
talk to you about is the hilt work. So you collaborate with other makers to do hilt work, and I feel like some people would see that as some sort of cop out and cheating, but that is actually a very traditional approach to sword making, which we kind of touched on earlier when we were talking about the Roman swords. But usually the person
Mm,
who designs the sword isn't even necessarily the entire maker of the sword. They're just designer, and then they hire somebody to do the blade, and somebody else to make the hilt, and somebody else to make the scabbard, and somebody inset the jewels or do any kind of inlay work or something like that. And so
hmm.
you collaborate with other makers, um, especially around hilt work. Like in this previous
Yes.
one, you worked with Matt Berry, and you've done a few swords with Matt Berry, and you've also done some. Um, I can never remember his name that did the hilt.
Sandeep.
Sandeep, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is a technique called kafgari, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's all like, silver. So that like the gold on there is Kafgaridon, and then the rest of that was overlaid with silver, and then it was like chased. So then the
yeah.
pattern was chased into that silver on the
Which
surface.
which is kind of crazy to think about on its own because they're starting with it's an iron sub or a mild steel substrate, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. And so,
yeah.
but they're
So
chasing. Or sorry, go ahead. You go ahead.
yeah, and so they score the surface, lay on just with like pressure, lay on the wire that then becomes the design or whatever, and then and then in this case they just go in and with chisels create that design. You can't
Yeah.
really see it so great in this picture, but yeah, that all the silver on there is all like it's all detail work.
Yeah. No,
um,
it's really astonishing
yeah, so
stuff.
he does, you can find him traditional uh, gosh um, traditional art decor, right?
Let's
um,
see.
Double check. Um, but he,
Yeah,
let's see.
he's all one word traditional art decor
Yeah,
on Instagram.
and he is totally worth following. His work is super cool.
For sure.
Um, and and yeah, so I've bought quite a few handles from him. Um, and I've done quite a few talwars and kandas.
Yeah.
Um, and
You mean
and
like
yeah,
these?
and there's plenty of swords that I do my own hilt. Where oh yeah, there we go, right. and there's plenty of swords that I do my own hilt work on, but in
For sure.
general, the thing that I really like doing is making the steel. So
Right.
if you know if it works out that somebody else gets to make the handle, well, that's good with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and Sandeep is so talented. I don't know but I'm not in it, but I don't know anybody else who's doing that work at such a high level. Um,
Yeah, I mean Jordan's over there studying with him right now.
yeah, Jordan Lamote, where's he from? Is he from New York State, or I can never remember, or
Is
Vermont?
Yeah, somewhere in that region,
Somewhere up there.
right? I'm not
N
exactly. I'm not.
Not
I'm not
far from you.
exactly sure
Yeah,
his hometown, but yeah, somewhere in the Northeast.
yeah, Jordan Lamote's
It's
out
not too
there
far.
training with him, and, hopefully, he'll bring some of that knowledge and understanding back and offer some classes. Because just in general, like, it would just be super cool to just even I mean, I've seen some videos, but to see it in person, to see it done demonstrated in
Yeah,
person would be tremendous.
yeah. I mean, I would totally take that class.
Yeah, for
I
sure, it's so cool.
yeah. There's
Um,
so much cool stuff. Yeah.
I wanted to jump to something very different. Um,
Okay.
so this is a
Yeah.
trident.
That thing. Yeah.
You say that like you love it so
Yeah, man.
much.
Oh, it was another one of those things where somebody, a client, I'd done work for them in the past. I did a sword for them, and then they wanted to try it, and so I was like, yeah, sure, I could do it. And it's it's like anything when you're doing something new.
Yeah,
It was just, uh, it was very challenging, right? And then part of this also was this was like in the beginning of building these really complex mosaics. And so
right.
when you're looking, or for me, building these complex mosaics, and so when you're looking at those tines that go out to the sides,
Yeah,
that was put together in, using, um, the kind of the method of building a long bar. And
right.
then I had to cut, I had to cut it. I drilled a couple of holes and then broached the hole and drifted it to allow that center spike to go through.
Yeah.
And that was, I had to make that twice.
Oh
So
my
it was,
god. Oh, that hurts me.
yeah,
I mean, I know how it
yeah, man.
feels,
But
but I can't even imagine. Oh,
yeah,
with all that's
I
going
mean,
on there.
and so it ended up being an interesting project in the end. But it's another thing that is just like, I'm. It was like um, deciding that I was going to just be a bladesmith, right? And so now I'm more like, well, I'm just going to be like a swordsmith, swords and knives. Like I don't, I'm not really doing. I have a couple of axes that are coming up,
Sure.
and I'm not doing any more axes after that.
Yeah.
Unless it's a
You're like
thing that I really decide I want to do.
I can just imagine
Uh,
you're like,
but
"Never again." Ah,
yeah, yeah,
so happy when that
yeah.
one's
There's a
done.
lot of never agains. It's like inlaying white gold. Just don't do it.
Oh, yeah.
That stuff is like stainless steel, man. It's crazy. It's so hard to inlay.
Yeah. Ugh. I
Just go
wanted
with
to jump to
silver.
this really quick. This is a intermediate step for that
Oh yeah.
flowers and vines. I can't tell if it is
Yes.
the first or second one, but, um,
I Yeah.
that is an
That's
intermediate
the
step
second one.
before
Yeah.
forging the blade out. Do you know that
Yeah.
because the
Yeah.
sun
So
down at the
that's
bottom?
setting in that. Yeah, it's got that sun on the bottom, and so that's setting up that serpent, right? Because you got to lay up
Right.
out everything straight, and then once it's straight, then you can, you know, making sure that you leave room in the pattern. You can see um, how I left a little bit of extra material, and then by utilizing that space between um, the tiles of the flowers and the tiles of the leaves,
Yeah.
you can cut that away and then keep that pattern nice and filling the space.
Sure.
And then it gives you that serpentine look, which is really pretty awesome stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's a.
I
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say that I find that I gravitate towards like that manipulation a fair amount,
Right.
because it just adds a unique look to things, you know.
Yeah, we got another one here. I'm trying to. I can't see my little side images very well because they're teeny tiny.
Mm.
But I have another serpent that you did. Is it that? Nope, not that one. That's a cool one though. You can talk about that.
Mm. Yeah, so this was for a video game company
Okay.
um, called Gala Games.
Gala Games. Okay.
And so they commissioned two swords from us, and this was one of them. And so this, you can see like the kind of overarching theme of a lot of the stuff that I do, where I'm building patterns and then connecting like in tiles,
Right.
connecting those into my rails to build um, continuous lines and try to really like
Right.
blur where one tile starts and the other ends.
It's cool. I
Um,
I never really noticed this before on this blade, but it has this look of like a tall, narrow wizened tree, like a willow or nah, maybe not a willow. I don't know, some sort of cottonwood or something like that going up the middle of the
yeah,
blade.
yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. A lot of people were like, "Oh, it's like it reminds me of Gondor,"
Oh,
right?
the tree of Gondor.
But
Yeah.
yeah, but I mean, you can see, you know, where I'm kind of harkening back to a lot of those Roman spatha. You know,
Sure.
I mean, you can see how, you're building like these lines that branch from each other and connect in and try to like, so much is so much of my work is palmette adjacent.
Palmet adjacent.
Or yeah, yeah,
Nice.
that's
Uh,
the line there.
this is another serpentine.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so this one was kind of building like a more of a this was a Viking style blade, in its hilting, um, and you can see I'm bringing in some of that like weave pattern
Sure.
into that central bar,
Right.
and then making it a serpent, and then adding some twists and some high layer edges. High
Yeah.
layer. I think those are probably like 100 layer edges.
Right.
It's about what I generally settle at.
I'm gonna
Um,
oh, go ahead. Sorry. I'm
hmm,
just gonna
no,
cut you
what's
off.
up?
No, keep. I was just gonna jump back to that vine one if I can. There it is. Um, because I feel like a lot of people are confused as to how that's created, and I know you kind of touched on it real quick, but you built in every time there's a scallop where you've cut into this started as a straight bar. Everywhere you
Yes,
cut in and removed material, you had built in sacrificial material.
yes,
Unpatterned material that then this bar gets straightened out, forged straight again, which creates then the serpentine activity down the blade, and then you forged your sword.
yes.
Right.
And now you need to be super careful when you're
Okay.
doing a serpentine pattern that you have to forge the bar out basically to length
Right.
before you put in your serpent, because if you if you serpent while it's still short and then stretch it out, that serpent then elongates and
Right.
becomes less
Mhm.
active, right?
Yep.
Now, one thing that you can do, and one thing that Matt Berry has done on some of his serpentine patterns, is is he'll do them on like a Viking sword. He'll put a serpentine. He does them a lot with like cable damascus,
Okay.
um, which which gives a pretty interesting dragon scaly kind of look.
Yeah.
But anyways, once he gets that done, he he serpents that bar. He then does his final weld up with his edge bars and everything. And then by forging in the fullers as opposed to grinding in the fullers, you can expand out that and accentuate that serpent,
I
right?
got
Just
you.
if you're
Right.
stretching that material out,
Right.
right? So those are some things to think about if you're
For sure.
going to go down the serpentine route.
We have a 1-2 punch. So here's the first step. And this is well,
Yeah.
I'll let you explain it. The houndstooth
Yeah.
back
So this is
spear point, right?
yeah. So this is it is a this is not actually wolf
Oh,
tooth
wolf
in
tooth.
the and in the cutting or chiseling in the teeth on their own. This is actually a mosaic.
Okay.
That is wolf
You
tooth
tricky.
like,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You know,
Nice job.
yeah, thanks. And so what we're doing here is setting up a fish mouth,
Right.
so that you cut out that section at the tip and then forge that in and weld it together to bring your pattern all the way around into
Yeah.
the tip. But yeah, no, this one was just I did a thin. So there are a couple of different
Well, you don't
bars
have
that
to
I kind of
explain it.
messed around. Okay, there we go.
I'll let you keep that secret. I see what you're doing. The second you said it was a mosaic, I was like, "Oh, I got it. Interesting. That's really cool.
Yeah.
I didn't notice that before." We did have JD actually on a previous episode, and he talks about the fish mouth. We don't get too crazy into
Mm,
describing it, but I will say I watched you guys do fish mouth welds several times while I was there, but I'd never attempted
yeah.
one until after I'd already left. And I found that to really get the tip to come together and to have to kind of mush the material, actually had to pull back the points because it looks like your fish mouth comes to fine points, and I had to pull it back actually,
Mm,
and then reform the tip, and that really helped to squish the material together and get a really solid because it just kept wiggling all over the place, and I kept like it wasn't setting properly, and I was not happy about it, and I actually had to attempt it. I attempted it twice that way before the third time I made those adjustments and ground that tip back from a fine point to a blunt point and then reform the tip. Because it finally, I was just like
mm.
racking my head. I'm like, what the fuck am I gonna do to make this shit stick? And that's when I was like, oh, if I pull that back just grind it back. And I think I pulled it back to like where the tip was like a 3/8 or half-inch blunt point, and then reform the tip.
Oh wow.
And
Yeah.
but the pieces that I was trying to weld together were also very long points, and fine points. So
Mm,
it's just like that's what I ended up having to do, and it worked great. And it never even dawned on me that that was a really key, at least for making that work for me. And I don't, you've done so many that you're more accustomed to them, but um, I found I had to actually blunt that point and then reform it to really get a solid weld out of that tip.
yeah. And now, are you doing those fluxless, or are you doing those with flux?
I was using
How are
just a
you setting
little.
that weld?
Yeah, I cut it and then I was moving it most of the way and then trying to clean it up a little bit and then using flux. Actually, I don't know if I did clean it up. I moved the points in at like a dull red. It wasn't super hot. Just hot enough to move the material. Um and then I think I was using and then I was using flux to help try to keep things kind of clean in there. And then I
Mm,
worked from the widest point of the point down to the tip, but the anytime I would go back to the wide point again, it would open up the tip But that makes sense because then the
Mhm,
material,
mhm.
because you I was basically like
'Cause you're
smushing it all
pushing
together,
it.
like,
Yeah.
but then you come back to the wide point and it goes a little bit, and I was like,
Yeah.
ah,
Yeah. So the way that I've been doing my fish mouths recently is I don't go down I don't go as blunt as you were talking about.
sure,
But what I'll do is I'll cut it down with like I do come to a fairly fine point, and then I'll forge it in, right, and then I'll let it cool, and then I go over to a grinder, and I just buzz the tips back a little bit to give me just a little bit of meat there,
yep,
and then I go over to my bandsaw, and I go through that spot that I had just
closed,
closed up, and so
yep,
I cut it again to just clear out oxides, and then I take the outside of it to close up the space,
I got you.
um,
The
and
whole
kind of
thing or
create
just the
that
tip?
environment. I the whole slit,
Yep,
and then after I clean it out, I just and I've had great luck with that.
nice.
I've also then added like a little like jacket at that, just jacket the tip,
Oh, sure,
and I've done that
interesting,
in the past too. But that's kind of like the way that I've moved
interesting.
in
I like
doing a
that.
lot of those.
I like that jacket move. Yeah, I didn't clean it out, and I only tigged just the very tip, where those 2 points came together. I didn't do any more.
Mm.
Um, I think it's pretty well stuck, but unfortunately, I messed up that sword, and so I feel the pain a little bit, and, it will
Yeah.
never officially become a real sword for anybody except I keep joking that I accidentally made myself a sword, but it's just gonna end up hanging on it's just gonna end up hanging on the wall. Um, but I wanted to follow that the fish mouth weld up with now this is how it came together, and you can see that fine
Yeah.
point, and it's
Yeah.
close. Yeah, that looks sweet.
Yeah. That was a cool spear.
Yeah. Okay, the last things I wanna touch on because we've been I wanna let you get back to your life. And again, I really
All
appreciate
right.
and thank you for coming on and chatting with me. But the last thing I wanted
Absolutely.
to show, at least picture wise, were some of your layups, just to help people get
Yeah.
kind of an idea of what your billet layups are looking like. And you said a billet like this is only about half-inch tall.
Oh, it's a half-inch thick. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was like the 4.5 inch one that I was talking about. That one
Yeah.
has like it's 124 pieces
Right.
in there.
Yeah.
Um, and so welding that together ends up being like really delicate.
I believe it because it's tall and narrow, and the chances of
Yeah,
things starting to buckle, yeah, gets really high and sketchy, right?
yeah. Once you get that any sort of tacoing effect, it's all downhill from there.
Yeah. Tacos,
So,
while they are delicious, are not what you want to be happening. And do you
yes, they're not delicious for your forge welds.
no. Do you, you jacket it at all to help prevent, unnecessary taco action?
Um, I mean, yeah, and so that's the final. Uh, well, at least what it looked as forged out into a bar there.
Yeah.
But I I don't the jackets that I use. I'm using like 20 gauge
I don't know
mild.
gauges. Is that
All
like a
right, so I'm
1/16 of
using
an inch?
like super thin mild steel, so it's
Oh, wow.
not going to um, it's not going to affect the rigidity of things.
Right.
But the first
Okay.
step that I take is I weld the jacket to the tiles before I start welding the tiles to each other.
Yeah, and then there's all
Right.
that extra cleanup as part of the whole thing too, right? That people don't
Well, but with how thin the steel is
Okay.
that I'm using for the jacket, by the time I have the sword forged out to length,
Yeah.
half the time the jacket has just disappeared.
Wow, really?
Yeah,
That's interesting.
you lose the jacket to oxide.
Interesting. Well, that's good to keep in
Yes,
mind.
it's
Um,
kind of a crazy thing to think about,
that does sound kinda crazy to think
and
about.
just like how much material we lose to oxides,
Right.
right? I mean, it's nuts.
I wanted to show
Um,
another layup.
mm, yeah, that's a fun one.
Looks
Yeah, and so
looks
this
like a
one is
koi
fun
fish.
because it's breaking away from square layups, right?
Right.
Because and that's been a huge step of the work that I do is I
Yeah.
not that I don't do some square layups because I certainly do,
Sure.
but I'm more often looking for something other than that. And so this I had a client that wanted a dragon themed sword, and I was like, I have this idea and I
Right.
think it'll work. And so yeah, manipulating your pattern. So basically with this, um, I took a pattern, and I re-squared it so it was going diagonal
Yeah.
through a bar. I I then brought in the sides a little bit so it was
Mhm.
no longer square, and then I ran it through dies that I made, with
Oh, cool.
an open side round top and then
Yeah.
two round bars on the bottom, and so I forged the bar into that scale shape.
That's great.
So the pattern follows that,
Yeah,
and then just cleaned it up and cut it up and laid it up.
and it turned into this.
So, and it turned into that. Yeah, there you go. Boom.
Yeah, super cool.
So yeah, that one was like probably like the most innovative thing that I've done
Okay.
is the different shape tile,
Yeah.
right? Uh, and Yeah, it was interesting. That was a really fun project. And then I did another one of the condas that I did last year. I did with the same tile layup, but I did it
Okay.
with like a fine crushed W's.
Interesting.
Um, and and so it gave more of like a shimmery tile look.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, maintaining that dark line on
Right.
the top of that, to give it that really like overlaid look,
Yeah. Well,
um,
and that's
for
it's so
critical impact.
crucial to get that effect. I
Yeah,
mean, I feel like it's super important for it to look right. But yeah, that's that's a piece I would have loved to have seen in person for sure.
yeah, yeah. Well, maybe when you come out here, we can make up some scale pattern.
Yeah. Well, and it's super cool.
Think about something crazy to put in there.
Something crazy to put in a scale. I I
Yeah,
I, I didn't realize for some reason I was just like I had assumed. Well, I guess that was my fault. I made it based on what knowledge and understanding was available to me at the time. I was like, oh, he cut those or ground them to shape to fit together. But it does make sense that you could do that, that you could forge it. You just gotta set it up and set up those dies. I feel like the hard part would be, n- and it probably would maybe take some trial and error, or maybe you just shot from the hip and you nailed it. But knowing what square shape to forge it to before putting it in those special made dies so that it would take up that form properly. Um,
yeah,
I can imagine that was maybe a little bit of I can't even think of a good way to do that. You know, you could do the area of the difference, but when you're forging stuff or of the different shapes and then figure out, oh, this scale shape takes up this much space, so then that means that I need to have a certain size square bar. But that when you're forging, it doesn't just automatically form into that shape. Um,
Yeah,
there's
because you have stretch sorts
yeah,
of stuff, right,
for
like
sure.
things aren't necessarily staying exactly where they are. Yeah, I did more of a shoot from the hip kind of thing of like,
Nice.
I did a couple practice runs of
Right.
being like, what if, yeah, with mild steel, just to get the sizing
Right.
right. um, and really when I ended up forging it out, that final run ended up being, like I said, I took a square and I forged my corners in. So I actually had, like, I mean, it ends up being like a hex like object, right,
Okay.
but it was a
Yep.
long hex,
Yep.
right, so that bottom point would seat into
Right.
the spot between the two bottom rounds, and then the
Sure.
top could just get deformed down.
You're
um,
crazy.
but yeah,
That's
I
great.
am a little crazy. It's and it's like you just sit there and you're like, oh, I wonder if this is gonna fucking work,
Was this a good
and then I'm
idea
like,
or a
oh, cool, we
really
got the
bad
bar. Now
idea?
it's time to cut it into 100 pieces, and
Right.
hopefully that'll work. You
Holy
know,
smokes, right.
um,
Yeah, because that billet
but
layup is
yeah, no,
intense.
look. I'm sorry, what was that?
I was just saying right, because that billet layup is intense.
Yeah, yeah, no, it was tricky,
Yeah, and there's
and there's
splitting
a lot of messing
pieces.
around and stuff to make sure that
Oy, oy, oy.
I didn't have too much gapping or anything in there.
Sure.
Um, and then yeah, like the edges and having to split those tiles is always like so freaking time consuming.
Oh, yeah.
I just got
It's
done
a
with that
s
on my current.
oh, yeah. Even just I've
Yeah.
only really done, like, splitting down square stock, and even just those and cutting down pieces, like, it's just amazing how much time it actually takes. It's
Oh
surprising.
yeah.
It always surprises me. I'm just like,
It is.
"Ugh."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, man. And you know, it's there's a lot of um and you can't rush it, right? Like,
Sure.
because you have to take the time to cut it right, or you end up with a big gap or
Right.
what have you. And making sure that you have extra material in case one of those tiles doesn't quite line up or things aren't quite square. Because I'm putting together a basket weave right now, and
Yeah.
some of my squares aren't quite half-inch square, and so they're a little bit
Mm.
bigger, and so then my inch and a quarter inch bars that are, it's like inch and a quarter by quarter, then they
Ugh.
don't quite reach where they
Yeah.
need to go, and then and, man, it's like, got to modify this thing a little bit, but like you can't grind too much because then you're going to get into part of the pattern, and that's going to merge with what's going on the sides, and you want to keep it
Right.
isolated. you know all the craziness,
All the
all
craziness.
the crazy.
Alright, we do have a couple questions from the audience before we let you go. The
Sure.
first one is from Paul Elkins. He says, "What draws you to longer blades? Do you find they have more area to show off more intricate patterns?" So, which came first? Big blades or very cool patterns to put on big blades?
Definitely, like, bigger blades came first.
Yeah,
Then as I've started to dive more into these like intricate mosaics, um, they just work out perfectly together. They work really well. And then there's also really interesting challenges of being like, well, you can make a pattern that looks really good on a double-edged sword, right? But like, how will that translate to a single edge? And
sure.
can, like, what pattern is appropriate for this blade or for that blade?
Yeah,
Try to look back and find some things relating to the culture that sword comes from, or things that relate to the person that you're making that sword for. And so,
right.
yeah, big blades end up being a great palette for things, and it also gives you that opportunity to have, like we were looking in that first sword that I did with Matt Berry,
Yeah.
you know, room for that pattern to evolve. Like you
Right.
got room to work,
Yeah.
right? And you see that in several of my swords. I don't necessarily keep the same pattern
Yeah.
going the whole way through, and that's not necessarily true for everything. But on a lot of
Sure.
swords, when I can, I create like an evolution of a pattern.
Absolutely.
I was looking at these different tablet weaving books. I think I shot you some pictures like
Oh
a
yeah.
year ago or
Right.
something about it. And you look at these tablet weaving books, and like a lot of the shapes are things that we can achieve in steel, and they're
Right.
crazy. They're nuts. Like, the amount of stuff that you can, that they were doing with this tablet weaving, and in a lot of that, they also have an evolution of things, and so we can take some of that and incorporate that into the steel that we're making. Like now we're like really innovating, and now we're like, and a lot of that builds off of that same principle of building a tile that has lines that exit the tile that you can then use to connect to other things that are going on.
Yeah.
I don't know, that's where I'm at. That's where, like, those are the things that like really excite me about stuff, right?
Sure.
It's like
Well, and you were talking about
building that
single
or
edge before. And one I like is
yeah.
just exactly this is a play on the palmette, but the way that the things kind of come together, it creates like this cityscape going down the blade,
Yeah.
which is so cool. With what looks like what could be interpreted as like a river running alongside the cityscape or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really cool things like that you can build, and like building that imagery, right?
Yeah.
Like when you and that's kind of one of the really uh, uh, awesome things about that flowering vine is that it's
Yeah.
not just like a pattern of a vine; it's a vine, right?
Right.
Like it is not an overall, like, oh, we did like a patterned flower. It's, here is this thing, here's this image, as opposed to
Right.
here's this pattern,
Right.
right?
It's an
And so
overall
so
composition
you know
rather than being a single element repeated several times um in a
yeah.
kind of a tapestry kind of way. This is more like yours have the overall thing is like the one thing. Um, I'm doing a horrible job at using words right now, but hopefully people understand what I'm saying. It's like the composite. I used a smart word earlier, the composition. So yeah, I don't know.
Mhm.
Yeah, especially like I wouldn't just say, oh, I can see like this is just a tile pattern repeating down the blade. Like to me, this flowers and vine pattern, it is the whole blade is the pattern because if it was just one section of it, it would not be that pattern. But with a lot of mosaic patterns that people are doing, if you can isolate just one portion of like what would be basically one tile's worth, you see the pattern. That's the pattern right there. Where yours, you
Mhm.
need the whole thing for it to be the pattern that it is. Yeah, which is
Yeah,
cool.
yeah,
I
yeah.
like that a lot.
And yeah, absolutely. You know, and doing your, one of the things that I try to do is I try to break the, as I had said earlier when we were talking about the scales, is
Yeah,
like how do you well get away from squares, right? And
sure.
if you're using squares, how do you or like I do a lot of like rhombus pieces,
Yeah,
you know um so that way my one pattern from one can kind of invade that where the pattern from another comes from,
sure.
right? So you have overlap in where things kind of cross, and if you do it um in like, because it was the same thing with the flowering vine, those were all rhombused as well.
Hmm.
And you're in doing that with like a big black background, you know you can really blur tiles, so it stops looking like tiles, right?
Right,
And starts looking like something different.
right,
Stops looking like squares and starts looking like something different, um,
for sure.
one of the things that I've been thinking about with those uh, with the scale pattern, um, I think that you had sent me a link a while ago, but about a Roman mosaic floor that was like just unearthed at that
Mm,
point,
sure.
and they had that scale motif going on.
Yeah,
Um, but you can stack those scales in other ways than just lining them up like a dragon. You can like if you flip one upside down, put it on top of the other, then you can put two to the side.
for sure.
Right now you've made a whole different craziness.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's so many things out there, and I know I talked to you for a little while about like, a while back about like an anxiety of not being able to create the things that are going through my head,
Sure.
right? Like there's too many things in my head, and I have this anxiety that like I'm not making all of these things that are in my head,
Yeah.
you know.
Or somebody else is gonna make it if if I don't make it quick enough.
Yeah, somebody else. Yeah, like with the scale pattern. Earlier this year or late last year, there's some guy in France made. I don't remember the maker's name, but he made a knife with the scale pattern. I mean, his pattern was different. It was like more arcing lines through the scales,
Mm,
but he did it. It was the same, essentially the same pattern, right?
interesting.
Or the
Yeah.
same layout, right?
Yeah.
Right. And because he saw it on uh, it was like on a serving tray from a cafe that he liked to go to, and he
Sure.
was like, I bet I could make that, right? Like we do all the time. Like I was watching Thor, uh, like over the couple winters ago with my wife, and I'm sitting there, and one of the guys is wearing like one of the professors or whatever is wearing like a knit sweater. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh man, I think I can make that.
Oh, it's like a cable knit
Right?
pattern or
He's
something like that.
Yeah, and you see
Yeah.
these patterns everywhere, man. And
Yeah.
and it's like, is somebody else going to see that and make that before I can make that? I want to make it first.
Right. There's never enough time or
That's the
or
problem,
maybe
man.
freedom. Time and freedom. Yeah. Well, and I think what you're doing with the collaborating, I think that's smart because that frees you up to go to the next blade. And let
Yeah,
somebody who's obviously very competent in hilt work to do the hilt.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think you know, it's been working out well for me. So we're going to keep going down that path for
Hell
a
yeah.
while.
All right, we got another one from Jeroen Nippenberg. He says, "Hi Jamie, your ability to do large and complex mosaic Damascus tile welds is very impressive. In my own experiments, there are always some small seams at junctions that don't weld properly. Could you share some pointers on how to get successful tile welds consistently? Thank you very much and keep up the incredible work."
Hmm. Um, well, first off, thank you very much. I appreciate the praise. Um, and I think that what a lot of it comes down to is like we were talking earlier, making sure that you have enough that you're. I'm not sure how you're doing your layups and things, but
Sure.
making sure that you're if you're using a jacket, that you're giving things enough time, that you're to for that carbon to do its work, right? Um, Making sure that you are re- reducing enough, right? Because if you don't reduce, you're not going to compress all any of those little flaws, those little spots where things don't line up perfectly, right? So you got to make sure
Right.
that you get enough reduction on your piece to fill in any of that stuff. Um, Going slowly and carefully, taking a lot of heats, doing minimal forging, right? Reduce a
So
little bit,
always working hot.
take another heat. Yeah, always working hot. You know, um, making sure that because if you let things get cold and you're trying to stretch things out on a heat, that's where, if you have a weld that's not completely consolidated, that's where you're going to come into a lot of issues with it. And I'm not going to lie to you, I went through a long period of having a lot of problems, and
Yeah.
and I still don't. I don't have 100% success rate,
Sure.
right? Um, but one of the other things that I do to hedge against um, those flaws is working in non-square shapes, right? Um, those rhombuses,
Sure.
it gives you enough overlap on the next bar to have, when you're forging it in, in on your sides, to have some overlap so you can get some compression there. And you're not relying purely on metal distortion, I guess, to create your welds. That pooching effect that we were talking about
Right.
in the very beginning of all of this.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. I guess those would be my tips. Make sure that you take it slow, that you have a good environment to promote that weld, and
Work hot. Jackets help.
work
And
hard.
just and
Jackets
just
help.
just to reiterate, a jacket. What do you mean by a jacket when you refer to the jacket?
So when I talk about jacketing a weld, is that that final weld, I'll throw a piece of mild steel on either side of it and seal it up. So it's essentially creating like a canister for um, that carbon to flow through and clean everything in order to get that good fluxless weld. Because
Sure.
I'm not using flux for really like anything here.
And in a billet like this one, where you have all these pieces, or even,
Mm-hmm.
the dragon scale one earlier, you're not relying on that jacket to hold everything in place. You're tacking everything in place before you throw a jacket on, right?
No,
No.
no,
Interesting.
I've done some tacking around on stuff, tacking of scales together, or
Yeah.
scales, or tiles together,
Yeah.
and then run into having funky spots in my
Interesting.
patterns from
So the
that.
freedom of the material to be able to kind of move and settle where it wants versus being kind of rigidly locked into place by a TIG, like a fusion weld or something. Do you think that helps lend itself to some of the successes that you've been experiencing with your patterns?
I mean, I feel like it certainly could. So, because what I'll do is I'll make sure that like on my sides, I always set up rails,
Yeah.
right? I always have
Yep.
rails for my edge,
For
right?
sure.
Um, you have a jacket on the top and the bottom that is welded all down the sides to cover the rails, and then I make sure I weld up anything on my ends. So all of the end tile, like my outer border, is all solid,
Yeah.
basically solidly welded together. And sometimes I'm moving my billets around, and you can hear them chink moving around inside. I don't know.
It sounds like a rain stick or like a shaker.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wow,
You ever
that's
dance with the devil in
awesome.
the pale light?
Yeah, I do. Something else you mentioned too earlier is that your billets, because you're doing large format blades, your billets are also longer because you're trying to reduce
Mm.
pattern distortion. Does your whole billet fit in the forge all at the same time, or are you only heating
Mm.
and welding portions at a time?
Not always. So yeah, sometimes I have to, I have 4 inches of a billet sticking out of the
Sure.
forge, so I can only weld one section, and then I have to move to the next section. Now, the big takeaway on that, if that is the scenario that you're in, one thing that you want to make sure that you do is that you're not forging down hard on that transition,
Mm,
right? So if
right.
you
Or
are,
cold and hot material are
you know,
sitting.
where, well, you want it to be, you want to forge basically down in a taper,
Okay.
right? And this sounds kind of weird, right? But if your dies are coming in and hitting hard here on one heat, even if you have plenty of heat on either side of that, if you are creating it like a hard corner there,
Yeah.
you're going to have a really hard time getting things to weld where you've made that
Mm,
that
yeah.
hard corner. So I forge it down, more towards one end, and then I'll put it in, and then I'll forge down, and then I'll smooth it out,
Yeah.
and do a lot of cycles on in that transition
Yeah.
area as well, because it's taking little bites, like I was talking about earlier, making sure that you're doing little bites
Yeah.
in those initial welds.
That sounds risky as
Um,
shit. I'll tell you what.
Dude, it is. That's what I said, man. Dancing with the devil.
In the
You
pale
know,
moonlight.
yeah. I was asked out of all my prey. I just like the sound of it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because it sounds like you are trying to work and kind of, I don't know if not tacking all the pieces into place has been a kind of a follow-up issue or result, or I guess um a solution to having prior welding issues, or if it was just an experiment, or but it feels like you're trying to also honor kind of like those traditional techniques created, you know, a- accomplished by the ancient smiths from Rome who were making those complex mosaic damascus patterns, um with, very limited technology. It's just basically
Yeah.
skill.
So, I mean, what if that's how they were doing it, man? What if, because pretty much all of them have edge bars, right?
Yeah.
I don't think every pattern has an edge bar, but a lot of them do.
Yeah.
So what if you made like a little U of super thin material? You lay in your pattern, and you have that jacket. You wire everything together.
Yeah.
There you go. I don't know. That's probably not how they did it, but we could
It
try
could
it.
be. I
It might
mean,
work.
now we're getting into, I learned that this kind of approach is called archaeology, where you're
Okay.
recreate, or is it experimental archaeology? I don't remember. One of those.
Experimental.
But where
Yeah.
you are working to replicate techniques, and like you said, like we'll never ultimately know unless somebody comes across some crazy scroll that talks about how this stuff was done. But we'll never ultimately
Mm.
know. But the best we can do is try to work in, um and recreate the technology that was available at the time, and recreate those patterns using that technology and those skills, and knowledge and understanding. um yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting. We've talked about this at great length before, for sure. um but
Mm.
we don't need to go into it again. But I will say that you are doing some badass work, and if people are not following you, they need to step up their game, and get some inspiration in their daily life. And go follow Jamie on Instagram, on Facebook. Um, it's Jamie Lundell on Instagram, right? It's not Nightfire's Forge.
Yep.
Nightfire Forge. Do you
No.
use the
No.
Nightfire Forge, or just your name?
No, just my name. I mean,
Okay.
Knight's Fire was the business that I started forever ago, and
Yeah.
that kind of that was when I still have it as like my email address and whatever, but like
Sure.
it is not a current entity.
I see. That's better than having your college email.
Yeah. Yes.
You stepped it up
Yes, it is.
to your first business email. um, but yeah, follow Jamie, follow his work. he and you guys also have a Patreon, right? You guys still rolling with your
No,
Patreon
we do
or
not.
okay.
We do not anymore.
Okay.
There is. We had a Forge Patreon, um, and Matt Parkinson is now doing a Patreon, um,
Okay.
uh, as opposed to the Forge doing it.
I got you.
So
Okay.
that's where that one ended up.
Sure thing.
Um, and but yeah, no, but we have a class coming up,
Oh yeah.
you and I.
Shit. I almost forgot to even
We should
mention
talk
that.
about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So I'm gonna
Yeah.
be out in the Northeast in October, and I started talking to Jamie a long time ago, and actually House Bear Forge jumped in and was asking about our class that we're gonna be doing. So Jamie and I are going to be talking about advanced pattern welding. So this is definitely a class that's going to be for somebody who has a very solid foundation in Damascus making. This is not this is my first time making Damascus class. Not even close. I feel like this is
Mm.
definitely more advanced techniques, um, both in pattern development as well as pattern welding techniques as well, and discussing some of the stuff we touched on here, but kind of going a little bit more into depth about some of those various aspects. Um, yeah, and the date we got is October. What is it? The third weekend in October, 21st
Yeah. So it's the
or 22nd?
15th, right?
No,
October
it's got to be the
22nd,
22nd.
the 15th. Well, we'll see.
Hopefully it's
We're doing great.
yes. Hopefully it's not the 15th because I'll be at Zach Jonas's that weekend doing some work. Um,
Yeah, it's the 22nd.
Perfect, perfect. 22nd of October, and yeah, I think it's going to be a really great class. It's definitely limited, very limited numbers going to be in the class, but we are going to be busting ass and really dropping some knowledge bombs. I just realized when I said busting ass, my first thought was people just filling the shop with farts. That sounds horrible.
Well,
We
we
don't
have an
want
exhaust fan, so it'll be fine.
good. Exhaust fans are handy. Um, but yeah, we're gonna be doing a lot of knowledge dropping, and I think that is honestly really gonna be the major takeaway from this class. So this isn't gonna be a typical kind of make and take class where you spend time making something and then leave the class. That's not how this works. This is and that's another reason why we're trying to reach people who are a bit more advanced in their Damascus making because they don't need to take something away from the class, but what we are offering are some really serious knowledge bombs that are gonna really, I hopefully advanced your understanding of pattern welding and steel making and forge welding techniques that are going to take your work, several levels higher than what you're already doing, because with these understandings, like, you can do all kinds of crazy stuff, like what, especially getting stuff welded the way Jamie's getting things welded up and accomplishing and successfully accomplishing all these crazy welds. um you know I think it's gonna be a really cool class, and then we're gonna have a lot of fun, and we're gonna really make people think, and we're gonna stretch your brain. So make sure you drink lots of OJ and eat
Mm,
big fat breakfasts because we're gonna make you put your
make
brain to
that
work.
brain work.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And so we'll be doing step by step through a couple of Mareko's patterns, a step by step through a couple of my patterns, really like
yeah,
getting in depth on how we develop those patterns and how to
yeah,
build them, and then also looking at like other patterns and how to deconstruct them, right? And take those elements and repurpose them and build them into something else, kind of like I did with the
right,
flower and vine.
yeah,
You can see a piece of work that somebody else did and say, oh man, lock onto one little element, take
right,
that and run with it and make something completely different, you know. And so we're going to be talking a lot about deconstruction and of patterns and and development of new patterns and how to
sure,
kind of innovate, or how we've been innovating in in this in the medium of Damascus.
Yeah.
There we go. Medium.
Hell yeah. All right, everybody. Jamie, especially, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Hopefully, a few brains have been melted already, and people have got a lot of positive takeaways for this from this conversation. Thank you again to all of our super sponsors. Um, you guys are the anchor that helps drive this Patreon. And that's it for now. Until next time, bye bye.